Well, good morning. It is a little before 6, and this is what I'm going to call coffee and contracts. I wanted to bring you up to speed on a couple of things with the offer to purchase a contract for North Carolina. So, I've seen a lot of things as broker in charge of an office, and just wanted to kind of take a moment as a high level contracts conversation to tell you a little bit about the contract, the offer to purchase, and some reminders. First and foremost, anytime you're writing the offer to purchase and contract, best practices are always to type it whenever possible. Handwritten is acceptable, but then if you end up having to make changes, it gets scratched and initialed. Anytime you have a change, you have to strike through the original, have both parties initial and date the change in order for it to be valid. So best case scenario, just erase the old information, put in the new information, and everybody signs a nice clean copy. Because it ends up going to so many people like the attorney and the lender and the buyer and the seller and all the brokers, it's best just to have a nice clean copy. So other things to keep in mind is where do you get your forms? So if you've never logged in, you would get them from your association of realtors if you're a member. NAO provides that as a member benefit to realtors. Your office may provide it through things like .loop or an in-house share folder or some sort of online cloud. So you would have forms provided to you for as a realtor through those conduits. Lastly, if you're an attorney, you can of course have access to them because you wrote them. The Bar Association of North Carolina actually wrote our forms in conjunction with the Realtor Association to make sure that we continually have the most update and current forms. There's a lot of contracts out there, but I do believe that ours is the most bulletproof, which is why we want to use that. Other rules to consider with the offer to purchase is it is called an offer to purchase and contract, and that is the Form 2T. So it's an offer to purchase until it becomes a contract. So buyer or seller can make an offer either way, and then once it is signed by both parties and they have agreed to terms, at that point it becomes a contract. We have to be cautious with what we call a contract and what we say is under contract, because we are notorious for saying something is under contract. Well, it's not a contract or under contract until both parties, the buyer and seller, have signed. So that's the offer to purchase and contract. Also remember that you do not want to leave any blanks if possible. If it is appropriate, put NA or none. A contract with blanks can be filled in by anybody anywhere along the lines, and no one would know who filled it in. So by having the blanks filled in with NA or none, it prevents unauthorized or unagreed upon terms from being written in without consent. So that's the best practices. The offer to purchase is 23 paragraphs. We're not going to go through all of them right now. I am going to go through each paragraph a little bit with you on each page in subsequent videos so that you have an understanding of how to write the contract and exactly what it means. In short, though, I have referenced that this contract is the offer to purchase form 2T. I'll also tell you that every contract in your form software comes with an offer to purchase form, and it is 2G. And 2G stands for guidelines for the offer to purchase. So as you're filling these out, you have a resource that says paragraph by paragraph what each item is for, how to fill it out appropriately, and how best to make a bulletproof contract. Other concepts that I want to remind you of is the offer to purchase and contract is a two-party agreement between the buyer and the seller. It has not got anything about your agency on there. I know the agency information is on the back page, but that's not an agency agreement. The offer to purchase and contract is between buyer and seller. And the reason we got to be really careful and diligent with this form is because if it ends up going to court, if something does become a civil matter, we were the ones who created it. So we need to make sure that it is bulletproof as possible. So in conjunction with what the breach of a contract looks like, the breach between a buyer or seller, there's really only four possible outcomes. So a breach by the seller would entitle the buyer to sue for specific performance and say, hey, Mr. Buyer, we're under contract for these terms, so I'm going to sue you and make you execute this property or this contract based on the terms we agreed upon. So a buyer could sue for specific performance. A buyer could also be entitled to compensatory damages, meaning that the seller is saying, hey, listen, I can't sell, something's come up, but I understand you've incurred expenses. I'm willing to compensate you for those expenses. So any home inspections, any appraisals, anything you've incurred thus far, let me compensate you, set you whole, as we say, so that you are in your original state financially prior to entering the contract, and then we can mutually agree to terminate. So the buyer will either be entitled to compensatory damages or specific performance. On the seller side, if the buyer breaches, The buyer's sole and exclusive remedy in a breach in an offer to purchase in contract form 2T is what we call liquidated damages. And the only liquidated damages that we deal with in this contract are earnest money and due diligence. So the due diligence fee is typically expected to be given to the seller at the time of contract. It becomes the seller's money until we go to closing, and then it's credited back to the buyer. If the buyer terminates at any point during that contract, that due diligence becomes the property of the seller and remains so. So the other thing that's on the table, however, is earnest money. And earnest money does not become on the table or become an issue for the seller until we have passed the due diligence date, which we'll talk about in later videos. But once we've passed that due diligence date, then if the buyer breaches, the seller would be entitled to that earnest money. Which in your mind, you're like, we're not going to ever get there. It's no big deal. However, I'll tell you the case where I had a buyer who purchased the property, went through all inspections, we agreed upon everything, went to the closing, the morning of closing, seller had signed, moved out, rented an apartment. The wife of the buyer flies into town and says, I'm not living in this house. She had not seen it up until that point. I was the listing agent, had no idea, and so they terminated the contract the morning of closing. And the exclusive and sole remedy to my poor seller at this point was only that due diligence and earnest money. She had the due diligence. In this case, we were wise enough to procure about $3,000 in earnest money, so she did get some compensation. So don't undercut the importance of earnest money. It is usually not going to become a factor because most buyers would terminate during that due diligence period. But in that case, it did not, and so they needed an appropriate retribution, and an only exclusive and sole remedy to the seller are the due diligence and earnest money. So that's a little bit about your offer to purchase. We're going to dig into it in subsequent videos and go through each paragraph and each page and talk about the concepts from each one. So stay tuned and have all your coffee ready because we're going to have some good times with contracts.